Hey everyone, Back 4 Blood is finally here. It's a 4-person co-op zombie shooter and the spiritual successor to Left 4 Dead, developed by Turtle Rock Studios and published by WB Games. I've spent quite a bit of time with the game as I really wanted to test out everything and let you all know if it's a game worth playing. If you are new to the channel, I currently have a 1,000 subscriber goal, so if you do enjoy the video, consider subscribing and hitting the like button. And thank you so much to everyone who subscribed so far. With that said, let's get into it. You get to play as one of 8 different Quip-equipped characters called Cleaners, each with their own special bonuses and in certain cases special abilities. For example, some characters might be able to break out of a hold, while others might have some straight up bonuses to their damage as long as they do not get hit. While each character can be built however you'd like, some, like the Doc, are inherently designed to be played as a support character. All zombies we've come to expect from this style of game are here as well, and each archetype has several variants to it depending on what corruption cards you get. They all have their own weak spots, and you need to figure out where those are to take them down as fast as possible. Sometimes a corruption card will give you an armored variant of a special zombie covering its weak spot in armor, making it that much more difficult to kill. For special zombies, you have the Snitcher that screams when you attack it and causes a horde of zombies to swarm you. There's the Reeker that explodes when you kill it, and there's even a version that spits acid at you halfway across the map as well. And then the Tall Boy with his gigantic arm that will smash you to pieces. Some variants of it will even grab you up and squeeze you to death, requiring your team to save you. As far as the story goes, there's really not much to it. There's only a few cutscenes, and while they're very well done, the story is very basic and as cliché as it gets. There's really nothing engaging about it. You play as survivors of a zombie apocalypse, and you have to travel around a few dozen different locations, shooting as many zombies as you can along the way. There are some different lines of dialogue when you play certain levels as different characters, but it's so basic it's nothing really worth specifically seeking out. But while the story is clearly not the main focus of the game, the gameplay and the card system certainly is. Gunplay is very arcadey and feels just about right for this style of game. Don't go in expecting Battlefield or Wolfenstein level gun mechanics, but different guns do have their own feel and different amounts of recoil and such. And there's a good variety of weapons to choose from, everything from LMGs to assault rifles to shotguns, and plenty of melee weapons. There's a main hub area you get to visit in between runs where you can set up your decks, and it has a gun range where you can test out every weapon. This is really great to figure out what weapons work best for you so you can seek them out. You get a primary and secondary weapon, and there are 4 types of ammo, which will definitely be important, especially in higher difficulties, as running out of ammo can absolutely happen. Although I did run into some issues I'll talk about later in the review, for the most part, hit detection worked very well, and it felt very satisfying to watch a zombie's head explode every time you hit a headshot. Alongside your weapons, you also get offensive, support, and utility items that you can scavenge across the maps or buy from vendors before each level starts up. Those vendors also sell team upgrades like being able to carry more items or increasing the ammo capacity for the entire team alongside 2 randomized weapons and attachments. Those team buffs can prove to be very valuable, especially the ones that upgrade your items and can make them considerably better. So a team that actually works together in this regard has a much higher chance of success, something we'll be going over more than a few times in this review. But once you leave the safe house, there are a ton of items to scavenge in the world. Weapons and attachments work kind of like in Apex Legends, however once you equip an attachment, it is permanently stuck to a weapon and cannot be transferred to any new or better weapons you find along the way. I think they did this so people would not be staring at their inventory screens for 5 minutes every time they found a new weapon, although it is rough when you find a better weapon that has no attachments on it and you have to ditch a weapon that has some really great ones, so it can feel like a side grade at times. Outside of the weapons, the real way your character grows stronger as you progress through each act is through the card and deck building system. While there are going to be other deal breakers for people looking for certain things in the game, whether or not anyone enjoys Back 4 Blood is going to live and die on if you enjoy the card system, and I really can't stress that enough. And it already seems to be a quite divisive topic amongst players, so let's go over what it actually entails. First off, there's 2 versions of cards. The corruption cards that provide gameplay modifiers that adversely affect the player, and your personal deck that gives you bonuses and modifies certain aspects of the gameplay in a generally positive manner. The corruption cards are shown to you at the start of each level, and an AI director can also add in additional cards during a level if it feels your group is having too easy of a time. Or at least that's how I was told it works. In reality, it seems to be completely random, as I had groups that were doing really poorly that kept getting more and more corruption cards, where other groups I had were blazing through the levels and got none. But the corruption cards at the start can drastically change how the level is played and really affect the difficulty. Some cards can lay in a thick fog, making it very difficult to see others, or might add in a boss from another level at a random point in another. This definitely gives the game variety for sure, but whether or not your group will be able to progress can feel like it comes down to luck, especially on the higher difficulties, as some of the corruption cards can be significantly more difficult to deal with than others. And there do seem to be certain levels that almost always have some of the same cards, like a few levels always seem to have armored variants of the standard zombies. So if you are someone who likes each playthrough to feel different and don't mind the difficulty being drastically different each time you play through the campaign, this might be something you really enjoy. When it comes to beneficial card decks, there's 3 sets, one each for solo, multiplayer, and swarm mode. They are all the same cards, however, they are kept separate when you build a deck for a few reasons. We'll circle back to the solo decks in a bit, but the multiplayer deck is really the main focus of the game's progression. Only a few starter cards are unlocked at the start, and you can use supply points that you gain from completing levels to unlock cards in a supply line. Each supply line has 8 items, although it's a mix of cards and various cosmetics like gun skins or sprays, stuff like that. I tried out quite a few decks and variations, and there's a ton of potential combinations. While most decks will have a theme like a shotgun build or support build, you do generally need to build in some flexibility, as you never know what corruption cards you'll be dealt. Each deck consists of 15 cards, and then you can set the draw order. You always start off with the first card in the deck. After that, we'll draw the first 5 cards, and then you can choose which one you want to start off with. So while you always know what order the cards will be drawn in, you do have some flexibility in the order that you can choose them. As you get to higher and higher tier cards, they start making more and more drastic changes to the gameplay. For instance, there's a starter card that increases reload speed by 20%, however, a later card can increase it by 50%, but completely disables aiming down sights. Now, for a sniper build, that might not be the best idea, but if you're using a shotgun melee combo build, it might be perfect. And when it comes to melee, you have cards that will increase melee damage and damage resistance while using melee weapons, amongst other stat boosting cards. There is one card that allows you to do a charged up heavy attack, and I wish there had been more gameplay altering cards like that in the game for melee combat. I really felt it was missing a block or some sort of dodge roll, as a lot of the times the combat really felt like it called for it. But you will need to make a number of decks depending on the situation and what chapter you're playing. If you do quick play and get sent into a game that's already in progress, someone might be already using your favorite character. You can take over one of the bots, then choose your own character at the start of the next level, but if no one is playing a support role and you do not have a support deck, it will make your run more difficult. For that reason, you do need to have a deck for all builds and playstyles unless you're exclusively playing with a pre-made group. But regardless, you really do need to enjoy the deck making aspect of the game because it is one of the foundational pillars of the game. When it comes to zombies, there's a decent variety. As I mentioned earlier, there's plenty of special zombies, but there's also a few bosses and variants of the normal zombies. For the normal zombies, it really depends on the corruption cards. You can get a zombie who's on fire or even one that explodes when you hit it in the head. So fighting these zombies will require a different strategy as they can be deadly if you're too close to them when they die. There's really only one unique boss in the last level of the game, but there's 3 others that can be inserted in levels as corruption cards. There's the giant ogre that will tower over you and will require everyone hitting its weak spots to take it out. The only thing is, since it's so big, I found I could easily cheese the encounter so he could not reach my group, and several times it got stuck on the environment and just stood running in place. However, the Hag in particular can be really troublesome on harder difficulties, as it will run when wounded and pop back up at a random time to assault your group. Level design is a mostly linear affair with the occasional diversion path. There are randomized elements like supply and weapon locations, and sometimes a door will be blocked and you'll have to go down a different hallway, which is standard for this style of game and totally fine. There's a few hidden caches in each level behind locked doors, which will require a toolkit to get in. These rooms generally had great supplies and weapons, so it seemed to be worth it to always have at least one person carrying a toolkit. But the level design did leave a considerable amount to be desired, and I'll go over that in more detail in just a bit. First, let's talk about the PvP mode. When it comes to the Swarm PvP mode, it does feature a limited selection of the same cards from the standard game. All cards are unlocked from the start, and several pre-made decks are provided for people who really just want to jump into the action. While I do think some people will enjoy it, unfortunately I found this gameplay mode to feel very tacked on, and it will require several balancing updates to fix some issues. Basically, it pits a team of cleaners against a swarm, and groups of 4 take turns controlling each side, and the team that survives the longest wins. While playing as the Ridden was pretty fun, the maps are so small that it feels like pure chaos, as you can spawn very close to the enemy team as long as you break their line of sight. While playing, you generate points that you can use to upgrade your abilities while waiting for your respawn timer. I honestly didn't spend too much time with this mode because there is no progression and the gameplay was just not engaging for me. But it is there for people who do want that PvP experience, but you just might have to wait for several updates before it really hits its stride. I played the Steam version, and I have to say I was fairly worried about performance after playing the beta, and then finding out Denuvo was being added into the PC version, But I have to say, even with my budget PC, the game ran exceptionally well even while recording. With everything outside of post-processing at the highest setting, I could generally average over 100 FPS with my Ryzen 5 3600 and RTX 2060 at 1080p. I did turn on DLSS to make the recording smoother, but while I was not recording, I simply didn't need it. And it is one of the better implementations of DLSS that I've seen, as the game still looks really good even with it on. Now, I know the game isn't going to win Best Graphics of the Year award, but there are some spots that do look quite nice. Okay, now that the basics are out of the way, let's get into some more questionable areas of the game. Now, some gameplay mechanics might be complete deal breakers for some people, while for others, they might be non-issues. Listen, it's not a bad game, but there are issues that will be present for everyone, and some areas of the game feel very unpolished and uninspired. That said, if you are simply looking for more Left 4 Dead, Back 4 Blood is basically that. I don't think it really improves on the formula, and in some areas it's a minor step forward, and others it's a minor step backwards. And of course, depending on when you watch this review, everything is subject to change because of the live service nature of the game. I do think some things will be improved over time, but all I can do is review the product that Turtle Rock felt comfortable charging upwards of $100 for at launch. Although at the same time, some issues I do not ever see being resolved, as it would take a complete redesign and overhaul of several gameplay aspects. When it comes to the single player, all of the cards are already unlocked, and you cannot earn supply points to unlock more cards for the multiplayer. To make things worse, there's only one difficulty, so there's no progression to the single player. And you will have to play the tutorial online to unlock all of the cleaners. It almost feels tacked on, and for those looking to just play single player, I don't see this being a particularly fun experience. You do get a group of AI companions to go through the game with, but the AI is rudimentary at best. I consistently had my AI teammates get stuck on the environment, and in some levels, I was essentially alone because my team was busy infinitely running into walls on the other side of the map. When it really comes down to it, to enjoy Back 4 Blood, you need a pre-made group or friends to play with. Everything from the ground up seems to be designed around teamwork and communication. And while I did have some good groups that did use communication, some issues with the gameplay will cause issues regardless of player skill. And the majority of the time when I was paired with people who did not communicate, the game was almost unplayable, especially on harder difficulties. On the easiest difficulty, friendly fire is disabled, and even if you get a particularly bad set of corruption cards, most groups should be able to progress. That all changes once you step up to the next level of difficulty. It seemed like people complained about the beta being too easy, so Turtle Rock completely overtuned the harder difficulties to the point where playing the game becomes tedious. And it can completely depend on the corruption cards you dealt, as several will make the difficulty from run to run drastically different. But let's go over why you really need a pre-made group to get the full experience out of the game. On the harder difficulties, friendly fire is turned on, and while I did have some issues in that department, I guess I was lucky because I've seen some nightmare stories from other players. Unfortunately, it seems like some players will join the game and simply attack their teammates. This can make a match unplayable, and you will have to waste your time leaving the match, then find another. Which is easier said than done, because I did run into some significant problems with the matchmaking not working at times. Also, at the end of the level, everyone needs to get into the safe room and close the door to complete the level. Sometimes, players will choose to AFK outside the door, leaving their teammates unable to finish a level they just completed. I did have this issue during the beta, but luckily I did not run into any problems of this nature while playing for the review. Although, again, I have seen other people having to deal with this. One thing I did run into was players intentionally spawning hordes. Now, the horde mechanic can vary depending on the corruption card you dealt, but needless to say, there's more than half a dozen ways to spawn one, like disturbing birds, setting off car or door alarms, being covered in exploder guts, etc. On the easier difficulties, dealing with these hordes is manageable, but you really need to avoid them at all costs in harder difficulties. There were several times I ran into problems where people intentionally caused every horde they could to try and wipe their group, and they succeeded. Now you might be saying, why don't people just vote kick any grievers out of the match? Well, at time of writing, there is no vote kick mechanic, so if someone intentionally ruins your run, you will have to leave the game and start over, which can be fairly devastating when you find a run that gets a good corruption card draw. And while these problems will hopefully be rare, even if you do not experience them, the difficulty curve is so drastic from one difficulty to another, you really do want to have a pre-made group to get through it. Not to mention, being able to plan out your decks as a team will give you a considerable advantage, as you can make sure that there's no overlap with certain cards. Like for instance, there's a card that allows you to sense weapons, and makes more weapons spawn. Having two people with this card would not be nearly as advantageous if having one person with that card, and another that does the same thing only with ammo. I have to admit, I was expecting a lot more when it comes to level design, especially from an experienced studio like Turtle Rock. While there are several decent levels, there were none I found myself wanting to actually replay, in a game where you're meant to replay each level dozens and dozens of times. Maps were generally very generic, and assets were reused in many levels, making it sometimes difficult to tell certain levels apart. They were a set of linear paths, and while that's fine for the style of game, there were no interesting locations outside of a few of the 31 levels. Mostly it's just stores, abandoned highways, or abandoned woods. With an infinite amount of unique and varied locations that Keem could have potentially designed, it's hard to understand why they chose the most basic things they could think of. I mean, there's a level where you have to blow up a ship and another where you get to navigate through a hedge maze filled with zombies. Those levels were actually decent, but they were few and far between and over far too quickly. There's really no puzzle elements, and even objectives can be pretty rare, and when they are present, they are very basic. It's generally carry some item to some designated location. Now, there could have been some fun to that, as while you're carrying a box or crate, you can only do the standard melee bash, requiring your teammates to protect you. Unfortunately, the levels are so small, you really only have to spend sometimes mere seconds to get the item to where it needs to be. In fact, many of the levels can be finished in less than 2 minutes, while others can take over 20. There's no pacing to the game, and I felt like several levels were so small that they were cut in half or thirds to stretch out the game length and make it seem like there were more levels than there actually were. Like I said earlier, there are tons of ways to cause hordes to spawn, and I found even while communicating with a good group, it could be possible to set off a horde by accident, generally by a stray bullet passing through an enemy and hitting an unseen object in the distance that wasn't even being rendered. I don't even blame people in most cases for setting off some of the hordes, as they clearly did it by accident, and I even did it myself. I did notice that sometimes birds would not be rendered properly when they were very far away. Bullets would shoot right through a special zombie into birds that I literally could not see rendered on my screen, and I'm sure the same happened to the people I was grouped with. So what we get is a game that does nothing outside of what's required to be average, and in a lot of areas feels sloppy and unrefined. It really feels like a budget $30 or $40 game, despite its $60 to $100 price tag suggesting AAA quality. And while there are no microtransactions in the game currently, it is absolutely set up for them, and I would not be the least bit surprised if they were added in later on. Zombies, especially special ones, can just spawn anywhere, sometimes right behind you, taking out more than half your health without you even being able to react to it, which is something that you really do not want to see in a modern game like this, and I feel like really sets the tone of what to expect. And the card system for me personally just didn't do it, but I do know some people enjoy building decks, and that's totally fine. Again, it's by no means a bad game, and if you have a group of friends to play with, you can probably get some fun out of it, but for most people, especially solo players, I think there are much better options out there for this style of game. So with that said, I personally think Back 4 Blood is wait for a pretty decent sale after several patches and content updates that have been pushed out. Rating a live service game like this is difficult because it's subject to change every patch, but I would rate it a 6 out of 10 as it stands right now. If you are really curious about it, it is on Game Pass, so I would recommend trying it out there before buying. As you probably know, I love these styles of games, so I had been hoping for a bit more, although after the beta, I unfortunately kinda knew what to expect. Anyways, I still have 2 more World War Z guides I'm working on that should be out soon. I might also do some for Back 4 Blood, but I'll have to see as I have a lot more games that I want to review coming out soon. If you did enjoy the video, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe. Thanks so much for watching, see you all in the next video.